I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry. Should I just start speaking? I don't know, like what the protocol is.
Yeah, you speak about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we have a short debate or a few questions. So go ahead.
Okay,
yeah,
we were talking about. Sorry. No, we were talking about thinking about 30 minutes of Q&A.
Okay, terrific. Great. Okay, so this was when Professor Kazicki contacted me, and she said that the lecture series is called Law in a Time of Crisis. I thought, other people could talk about COVID and all this, and I would talk about another kind of crisis, which is crisis which might come about because of the interconnected world in which we live in, the issues having to do with cybersecurity and particular cyber war. I mean, if this, of course, this is connected to the COVID pandemic, because there have been many attacks on hospitals, on global organizations, on defense contractors. There's been a lot of hacking going on during COVID, in part because it's been a time of great vulnerability, and also because since we all work from home, security at the edges is always weaker. But what I want to talk about today is because, this is a legal theory seminar. What I would like to talk about is conceptual issues having to do with cyber war. I wrote a book a couple of years ago on the legal regulation of war over 400 years, and which I wrote. It's called The Internationalist, which I wrote with my colleague Ona Hathaway. And when I went out and I would speak about the work, one thing that people always wanted us to talk about was cyber war, because they thought that, not unreasonably, that cyber war was the next phase in conflict. There was there's been a lot of confusion and a lot of debate about cyber war. And what I wanted to do today is spend about 20-25 minutes trying to disentangle some of the conceptual, legal, and in fact some strategic issues having to do with cyber conflict, cyber war. One of the things that people talk a lot about is not just the idea of cyber war, but a lot of people are skeptical that even such a thing is possible. They're skeptical not because of the technological constraints, although those are considerable. They're skeptical that cyber war is even possible. That is, they think that war and violence, things being blown up, they think that those two things go together, and that cyber conflict doesn't have that same kind of kinetic violent structure that traditional wars have had, and so that therefore cyber war is not even conceptually possible. And this is something that actually philosophers haven't debated, or legal theorists haven't debated, but cybersecurity people have debated, and security analysts have debated this a lot, surprisingly. It's actually really interesting to see when non-philosophers, non-theorists argue conceptually, because they, I always think of that's the kind of thing that we philosophers do. So one of the things that I'd like to do is try to separate a lot of different issues out when we talk about cyber war that are conceptual in nature to help us get a better sense of like what the debate about cyber war is about and how we might think of the legal regulation of cyber war going forward. It's especially important, again, even in the time of COVID, because the last thing any of us need is cyber conflict when we're dealing with this terrible, disruptive, infectious disease. Okay, so first thing I want to distinguish is between what people, when they talk about cyber war, and just regular kinetic war that uses digital networks and computer attacks. The second, that is using computers in kinetic attacks, this is not what I think people mean by cyber war. That is, I think since computers have been around, since the 1940s at least, computers have been used in warfare. And that's not at all surprising that they should be used in warfare. And it shouldn't be surprising either that that computer attacks have occurred in the context of traditional war as well. The United States, I mean, from news reports, routinely attacks the air defense systems of nations that it's attacking. It's bombing, it's sending bombs and airplanes and troops into that territory, but it's also launching cyber attacks as a way of supporting those kinetic missions. Now, I take it that latter, that the use of computers in kinetic warfare is not at all what people mean when they're talking about cyber war. Nor is it at all interesting or perplexing to talk about that. That's just using an instrument, another instrument in kinetic war. What people mean when they talk about cyber war is using digital networks as the sole instrument of attack, both as the target and as the weapon, okay? And the question that people want to know is, can you use purely digital means and still engage in war, okay? So that's the first thing I wanna point out, that when we talk about is cyber war possible, and when people talk about cyber war, they almost always mean the first, exclusive use of computers, as opposed to the second, because that is using computers in kinetic attacks, because everyone thinks that that's acceptable if the kinetic attack is acceptable. Okay, the question has to do with using computers exclusively. Secondly, there are two kinds of attacks that we really have to distinguish when we talk about digital cyber attacks. One is typically called info ops, information operations, and that's to be distinguished between, info ops is to be distinguished from infosec, information security, okay? Info ops is the kind of things that we read about in the newspaper about Russian disinformation or US disinformation or Chinese disinformation, propaganda, deep fakes, all this kind of stuff where what we're doing is we're manipulating information in order to change people's minds or to confuse them as a way of gaining some tactical or strategic advantage in a conflict. That's info ops, information operations. That's not what people mean when they talk about cyber war. They do not mean using trolls on Twitter or posting fake Facebook ads on social media. None of that is what they mean. They're really concerned with InfoSec, information security, that is hacking into computer systems and compromising the informational security of the adversary, either affecting the confidentiality of that information, affecting the integrity of that information, or affecting the availability of that information, okay? It is not about confusing people. It is really about exfiltration of information or shutting down of information processing devices, okay? So if we're kind of, if I had a blackboard, I would progressively narrow down the scope of the question. So we're not interested in the use of computers in warfare. We're only interested in the exclusive use of computers in warfare. And we're not interested in any kind of use of exclusive use of computers in warfare. We're interested in the use of computers to affect the information security of the adversary. And the question is, is that legal, or can that even count as something that's subject of legal regulation? Can it even count as a war? But before I get to that, let me go down and say we're not even really interested in situations where one party affects the information security of another party using computers exclusively, okay? We're interested in something more particular. And let me distinguish between three different areas of activity. One is crime, one is espionage, and one is warfare. Or I'm gonna just describe it neutrally by calling it conflict. Okay, so we have crime, espionage, and conflict. Okay, and these are different realms of activity. They have different characteristics, and most importantly, they're different jurisprudentially. Crime is very different from espionage, is very different from state-on-state conflict or warfare. They all are governed by very different rules. Crime is very different from warfare. Warfare is very different from espionage. So when we talk about cyber warfare, we are not interested in compromising the information security of some adversary for the purposes of crime, okay? And what would be the purposes of crime? Well, you know, some kind of monetary or pecuniary benefit that goes to the attacker, that is their own self-interest as opposed to some collective interest. Okay, so we're not really interested in cyber criminals, nor are we interested in hacking for the purposes of espionage, for spying. That's another thing that I think that people get confused about. It is completely uncontroversial that from the perspective of international law, one state can hack into the computer systems of another state for the purposes of spying, that is for collection of information, okay? So even if they're engaged in information security operations and they're doing it exclusively and they're doing it to another state, if they're doing it for the purpose of merely gaining information to help their national security, that again is completely acceptable, okay? It may not be acceptable from the domestic law of the victim state, but it's certainly acceptable from the international perspective. So what are we talking about? We're talking about, when we're talking about cyber war, we're talking about a very limited range of activities, okay? The use of computer networks to compromise the information security of another state for the purposes of whatever war is for the purposes of. Okay, I left that blank, obviously, because I want to fill that in. But it's not for the state's own pecuniary interest, their own self-interest of the leaders or the people who are doing it. And it's not to gather information for the purposes of learning about the adversary. It's for something else. Now, what is war traditionally done for? Well, this goes to the work that I did with my colleague Ona Hathaway, which I mentioned earlier, a book that I wrote with her called The Internationalists. And what we argued in the book is that traditionally the function of war was to redress legal wrongs which had been done by one state to another. Okay, so the basic principle of warfare since like the beginning of time has been that when one state affects or interferes with the rights of another state, that the state that has been injured has a legal right to claim compensation or cessation or restitution or some type of way of righting the wrong that was done to them, and that they are able to use force as a way of righting that wrong. And so what states would always do when they went to war is that they would say, state X, who is let me say the victim V, state V says to the wrongdoer W, you have violated one of my rights. You have to make me whole. If you don't, I will force you to using kinetic force. I'll send my soldiers after you. They'll shoot their arrows. They'll drop their bombs, whatever. Okay. This is not just a matter of law. It's a conceptual matter as to what war was or is. That is, if you didn't say why you were fighting, people would not consider that to be a war. If you just said, I want, one state says to another, I want your territory. First of all, as far as I know, that has never happened. I don't know. I mean, in my 10 years of studying these things, I've not come across a situation where a state has openly said to another state, we have no claim against you. We just want your stuff. In order for it to be war, there had to be a claim of legal right to it. Now, lots of times those claims were pretextual, they weren't genuine, but they nevertheless were part of what it meant to go to war, such that you couldn't even claim the rights of being a prisoner or being a soldier if you were captured, if your side had not made a claim of right because you weren't engaged in war. Now, what does that have to do with cyber war? Now, one of the things that people often say about cyber weapons is that cyber weapons are the perfect weapon because it's so hard to attribute an attack to the attacker. So it's really good to have cyber weapons because you can claim you didn't do it. Now, from the traditional perspective of war, that makes no sense. It makes no sense to say to your adversary, you violated a right of mine, but I'm going to attack you, but you're not going to be able to tell that I attacked you. Because if you can't tell that I attacked you, then how are you going to do the thing that's going to stop me from attacking you? That is, it's essential for the structure of traditional war that the victim, that the attacked can attribute the attack to the attacker. If they can't do that, the whole system breaks down, because then the person who's been attacked has no way of knowing what they're supposed to do in order to stop the bad thing from happening to them, because the other side won't say it's them, nor can they show from the forensics that it's them. So one of the things which I think is so confusing about cyber war is that not only is there no claim take any cyber attack, take the Stuxnet attack, which the United States and Israel purportedly, they created exploits to affect the centrifuges at the Natanz nuclear reactor in Iran. And they did this in order to slow down the production of weapons-grade fuel for nuclear weapons, because they didn't want Iran to create nuclear weapons. Now, the problem is that both the United States and Israel will not admit that it's them that did it. Now, if you can, if you don't say why you're doing it, then you can't actually participate in the very structure of war as it's traditionally understood. The way it would work if this were war is you would say to the other side, hey, stop making nuclear fuel. If you don't, we'll send an exploit in. Or we sent it, or once it becomes clear that you did this, you can then say, yes, that's us. We thought you were violating the Security Council Security Council resolutions about not creating these fuel or not being part of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty or whatever legal right they may claim. But they didn't. When Russia hacked the Democratic National Committee, Putin didn't make a legal claim. So one of the things that becomes hard to understand when we talk about cyber war is that it has it doesn't have the structure of traditional war. What it actually seems most like is what in the United States we call covert action. That is, where a state does something illegal to another state, but won't admit that they did it, right? They send in saboteurs to destroy some building or to kill somebody. This is something that doesn't have the structure of war. It has the structure of covert action. And in those situations, I think virtually everyone thinks it's illegal to engage in it. So if that would be if that's in fact, if cyber war was the use or threat of the use of force against another territory, then it would be illegal because it would be actually doing the thing that the law says you're not allowed to do. It's just you would be doing it stealthily and not admitting it openly. Okay? So the first thing I want to, this is a long way of saying that one of the reasons why people have a very hard time figuring out what kind of thing cyber war is that, first of all, they haven't figured out that it's actually a small box of all the possible types of computer attacks there could be. It has to be an exclusive attack. It has to be using computers only against the information security for the purposes of something that doesn't fall under crime, nor does it fall under espionage. the problem is that the states won't even say why they're doing it. So part of the reason why it's so hard to say what cyber war would be is that states won't even admit why they're doing it. And so therefore it's hard to categorize. But one of the things I want to point out, and I'm getting to the end, and this is really I think the philosophically important point that I'd like to get to, is that when lawyers, international lawyers, talk about cyber war, they naturally turn to Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, which is the main norm which regulates aggression between states, which says that United Nations members are prohibited from either using or threatening to use force against another state. Okay. Now, the way that lawyers have interpreted this in the context of cyber is they've used what's called the effects test. The effects test states that the use of cyber mechanisms, cyber weapons to attack the digital networks of another state violates Article 2.4 just in case the kinetic effects that it has would be similar to the effects that kinetic weapons would have. So if you're able to blow up a building using a computer, that falls under the prohibition of Article 2.4, just like if you used a bomb, okay? Because the computer is having the same effect as a bomb would. Now, I just want to say that makes this entire subject boring, uninteresting, and leave it to the international lawyers to do that, okay? I'm sorry, are there any international lawyers out there? Look, I teach a subject myself, okay? But man, they can really take a subject and put it through the deflavorizer. I mean, they can really make it uninteresting. I'm just going to state this and then you can attack me, okay? But I'm going to state the main point, which is that what is interesting about cyber weapons and why we need a law for the times of crisis coming up is not because we can now use computers to do things that we used to use bombs to do. That is not interesting. I mean, it's interesting from an engineering perspective, but it's not interesting from a legal perspective. It's not interesting from a philosophical perspective, okay? What is interesting about cyber weapons, and which I feel like nobody has come to grips with, okay, is that you can do with computers something you could never do with a bomb, which is destroy information, okay? Or change information, or temporarily stop the availability of information. This is not something that has ever been you could never do this before in the history of the world. What does that mean? What that means is that we need to rethink cyber war, not from the perspective of the uninteresting point that now we have a new weapon that we have to consider. That's uninteresting. What is interesting now is that we've moved into a world in which information is incredibly valuable. 2, we spend our entire lives in front of these screens, essentially just sending information back and forth to each other. And number 3, we have weapons now that can affect only information. So whereas before the law, especially the laws of war, but not just the laws of war, but also criminal law and much of civil law was concerned with physical security. The main question, I think, in the next century is going to be, how do we protect information security? And how do we deal with conflicts between states when the effort has been moved towards affecting the information of those societies consume and produce and manipulate, as opposed to buildings or boats or ships or bodies. That is, if we need to rethink legal theory and political philosophy for an information society, for a society in which the main threats are not just physical, like they have been since the beginning of time, but rather to our information. Because we live in a society in which our culture, our wealth, prestige, status, and indeed the very operations of our world depend on the storage, manipulation, and transfer of information. And it's the ability to stop that or to affect that. That is a new thing under the sun. And I fear that we as theorists have not really appreciated what is so interesting about the current moment and how we need to rethink security for the 21st century. Should I stop now?
Hi, yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Scott. It's very interesting, and I confess that it's a perspective that I almost don't know anything about. So it's completely new for me.
Okay.
And we have some time now for questions and answers. So people who want to ask something, I would like to make a small comment. In the way I see your position, cyberwar, the term, is a very narrow concept. And I think it's almost a contradiction in terms, because the presupposition of that characterizes the war are not there. So it's completely new concept. We have no instruments to handle this. What we should or could do about that? As legal theorists.
Well, so one of the things that I wanted to do, I'm laughing because that's what I was trying to do in this 30 minutes. I was trying to do one of the things that theorists do, which is we say we're not interested in computers that in war, because that's normal. We're not interested in any use of computers attacking information, because there's a difference between info ops and infosec. We're not really even interested in just infosec, because there's crime, there's espionage, there's conflict. So one of the things that I think we do as theorists is help isolate what the question is. And so that's one of the things I was trying to do. There's a lot more, I have a lot more to say about the subject, but I just wanted to kind of start the process of distinguishing so that we can get clear as to what we're talking about, okay? I think that a lot of people who think it's a contradiction in terms, and you're not alone, I myself am skeptical about it. I think part of the problem is that we just talk about these things without bothering to actually narrow down and be very clear as to what we're talking about. And that's what I think that like theorists like us can do, which is to be clear as to what the phenomenon we're discussing is. It becomes much easier to discuss a concept if you know it's actually quite narrow. That's the first thing. And second of all, one of the things I think we can also do as theorists is we can also talk about what's interesting and what's not interesting. That is, I just don't think the fact that, I just don't think it's interesting to say that you can use computers to blow things up. I'm sorry, I mean, blowing things up is bad, obviously, but I mean, like big deal. I mean, there's like lots of bombs that there are people who are someplace and they spend their time thinking about how to blow things up. Big deal. What we can do as theorists is we can help policymakers think about the fact that these new weapons don't blow things up, or if they blow things up, again, that's not interesting. What they do is they can affect the security of our information. And we, as theorists, are very good about thinking about security. And that's what I would want to focus on as theorists.
Yes. So who wants to ask something, make any comment?
Krasuski would like to.
Okay. Can I go?
Yes.
Yeah. Professor Shapiro, thank you very much. I would like to join two different dots of your previous production, and now with this conceptual analysis of cyberwar. And I want to ask you if this current object that you are investigating, have you seen already something relating to the economy of trust that you set out on legality? For example, we have this problem of the trustworthiness of our networks. So in this year's Munich Cybersecurity Conference, one of the hottest topics was the 5G implementation, the Huawei versus the United States version of it. So there's this economy of trust relating to the network. And I want to hear about that, if you believe that these two concepts are related or can relate or can be entangled in a way.
Thank you so much for that question. I will just tell you that I have been thinking a lot about that lately. One of the reasons why I've been thinking about that is because I'm writing a book on cybersecurity and about all the stuff that I'm talking about right now. And one of the things that I have been focused on is the ways in which human beings assess the trustworthiness of other people. And I think one of the things which is really quite interesting and perplexing about this cyber realm is the fact that we don't have the tools yet to figure out who's trustworthy or not. That is, our cognitive apparatus was developed not in this environment. It was developed in a situation where we could see each other and we could see their body movements and we could see the particularities of their facial muscles and stuff like that. And it's extremely difficult for us to figure out who's trustworthy when basically we're not relying on our eyes and our ears for it. So one of the things that I think a lot about is, I've been thinking a lot lately, is how do we increase the trustworthiness of our communications in cyberspace. Here's one thing to maybe we should teach students in school what are basic things about how not to get fooled on the internet. That is it should be part of the curriculum to learn what's trustworthy and untrustworthy behavior over the internet, because we don't yet know, we haven't yet developed those skills, but they should be taught. And it wouldn't be hard to do. It just should be like one of those things, like don't go into a van if somebody offers you candy. As we teach kids that, there are certain things we should teach them there. Now, one of the things that you're asking is a much bigger issue, which is the question of interdependence, okay, the so-called coupling, decoupling issue. So here would be one way of dealing with the lack of trust between the United States and China. Require that each state has technology from each of their states in their own state. That is, one way you can increase trust is if you require that the other side has a hostage, right? So, if China has 5G in the United States, then the United States may not very well want to engage in a war with China. Correspondingly, if the U.S. has technology in China, that would also prevent, or that would be an impediment for conflict. So the decoupling that I see that is happening between China and the United States, I think is a very worrisome development, precisely because A, we're very bad at figuring out how trustworthy we each are, especially in cyberspace, and we're also taking our hostages away. And that strikes me as a bad development, but I'm just a philosopher.
Scott, should we take 3 questions in a row and then you answer? Is that okay?
Sure.
So we have Igor, Thomas, and Chris.
Okay, so hi, Professor Shapiro. Thank you for your exposition. My question is actually kind of simple, and it's closely related to Professor Kozicki's commentary. Why should we even use the concept of war in this situation? It seems like an outdated concept for actions that are very specific to our contemporary times. And shouldn't we try to use another kind of concept, maybe new concepts, instead of talking about cyberwar specifically? And that's the question, actually. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thomas?
Hello.
Oh, hi, Thomas.
Hi, Scott. Hi, Katia. Hi, Vera, and everyone. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure listening to you talk, and the topic is really fascinating. I missed the first 10 minutes of the talk because I was in another meeting in my university. There are many things happening due to COVID-19. So forgive me if the question has already been answered, but from what I heard, you were worried about attacks in which we destroy information. But my worry is about not only destruction or adding false information, but the idea of manipulation. Do you think that manipulation can constitute a sort of a species of cyber attack? I'm thinking here in the lines of Joseph Raz, when he distinguishes between coercion and manipulation. When you have coercion, you remove the people's options. And when you have manipulation, you alter the way that people reason about things. So the problem with manipulation is that this affects your reasoning process. You add false information, and that can create a lot of damage. That can alter the course of elections. That can lead people to be imprisoned that can lead to a riot, or that can create an internal riot. So that's my concern. When you do it publicly, and you make people act crazy because they receive some very strange inputs, if that can qualify as a cyber war in your sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, Chris Bipales.
Oi, hi. I can turn my video on. I'm sorry.
Yes, you can. Gustavo Hick, please.
Okay. Hi. Okay. Hi, Professor Shapiro.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. My question is almost the same as the last one, but it's more like, could you consider fake news as a weapon in this cyber war? Because here in Brazil, I have a kind of a problem with that. We have lots of fake news, almost fake news. And it seems to me that like they could be considered like a weapon in this war. That's a very simple question, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. These are all excellent questions. May I just ask, Katja, how long?
Yes, okay. You can go.
No, I know, but how long? I mean, are these the last questions, or is this?
Yes, it can be the last three.
The last three. Okay. So can I talk for 5 minutes?
Yes. Oh no, you have all the time.
Oh, okay.
We're here to hear you.
Okay. So first of all, Igor, about war. So I just want to say, by the way, all these are excellent questions. So I thank you for asking them. So war, as if there are any international lawyers out there who haven't clicked off this meeting by now, they'll know that war is not a thing. War is not a concept in international law anymore. It hasn't been that way for about 100 years. The concepts that we use in international law are force, armed attack, self-defense, hostility. I think those are the main concepts. And so the only time that war exists, at least as a legal concept, is when it comes to certain types of domestic systems. Like in the United States, Congress has the power to declare war, so there you have to figure out what a war is, or the war powers resolution, there's issues about what a war is. There is no reason to take cyber and to put it into the war box. It's just that is what everyone is doing. So the reason is because war, despite the fact it doesn't mean anything in international law anymore, and it's lawyers don't really use that concept anymore, ordinary people do. And one of the things that we can do is we can say, you ordinary people, you don't know what you're talking about. War is not a thing anymore. It's too vague of a concept. Let's talk about something else. Or what we can do is we could try to figure out what is it that's bothering them. That is, what are they trying to figure out? And one of the things I think that they're trying to figure out is that they're trying to see, are computers and digital networks, are they just another kind of weapon that now we can use? Or is it something different? Is it different from just another weapon that we could use in something we would call war? And I think that the idea of war has been the idea of making a claim and insisting that the other side make good on that claim, by a claim meaning a claim of right. And so one of the reasons why I think that people are confused about cyber war is because they don't see the same kind of structure that they would see when it comes to bombs or planes or tanks being used for computers. So that's the first thing. It's not the word, it's the set of ideas that surround it. Number two, we're kind of interested, I think what confuses people is that on the one hand, computers can blow things up like other weapons, but they can do other things as they can affect information. And that's a new thing that I think that people are trying to get their head around, but haven't yet done that. So I think that that's why it's useful to interrogate what's bothering them, because what's bothering them, I think, are real things. And ultimately what box we put it in doesn't matter, but what matters is that, does it share features with things that we know how to reason with, reason about? And we have had roughly, several thousand years of thinking about war in the kinetic sphere. Perhaps it's applicable to the virtual sphere as well. Thomas, talking about manipulation, one of the things that you might have missed right before I had, and also, Chris, I'll talk about the issue about fake news and manipulation. One of the things that I had mentioned at the beginning was that there's a fundamental distinction between info ops and infosec, between information operations and information security. And the fake news stuff is in the info ops bucket, that is information operations. It's not in the information security thing because it's not violating the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of anyone's information. It's putting out ideas in order to confuse them. Now, should we, regardless of whether I said that cyberwar had to do with info ops, could infosec, excuse me, you may ask, well, could info ops be like a war in the sense in which bombs could be a war, or in which using computers to affect the information security, the way that could be a war. When I want to resist that. I want to resist that because it seems to me that there's no way that one can really distinguish between fake news and disinformation and doing what governments do all the time. That is, governments always engage in disinformation. They may not lie, a lot of them lie, of course, in the ordinary most governments just lie to us all the time. We hope they don't lie as much as we fear, but my president lies to, all he does is lie. Your president, all he does is lie. If you say that, if you start making manipulation into an act of war, then it turns out that our governments are warring with us all the time. And that just strikes me as a kind of consequence that would drain the notion of conflict of all meaning. What states do is they try to affect the information environment of their subjects and their adversaries through claims of fact, through claims of right, through claims of value, moral claims, religious claims, spiritual claims. They do it constantly. And to start saying that, well, when you do it to an adversary in a situation where you're mad at them, then that is considered war. But it's just really hard to distinguish that from the domestic case where the government is making false claims in order to affect part of the population or the opposing political party. I think things like fake news and disinformation is just normal. It's just what states do. It's just kind of, there's a way in which what they can do now is that they can get the volume of fake news has increased dramatically. But fake news by itself is like as old as governments. One of the things I think that the way I think fake news works, and this is slightly a tangent, but since you're stuck here anyway, I might as well say, because I'm actually interested, because I wrote about it today. One of the things that I think is really interesting about fake news is that maybe people know this book. Can you see it?
No, I can't.
Oh, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Oh, yes, I see.
Yeah, by Daniel Kahneman. And so one of the things that, so Daniel Kahneman, he worked with Amos Tversky in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, developing the heuristics and biases theory in psychology. He won the Nobel Prize. And what he does is he distinguishes between system 1 and system 2 thinking. And system 1 thinking is thinking fast. That is where you're able to identify things very quickly, especially identifying threats very quickly. And then system 2 thinking is analyzing threats using what we philosophers call rational cognition. We're using rational choice theory or statistics or whatever. The point that Kahneman makes is that system 1, like most of the things that we do are fed to us by system 1 without us knowing about it, because they're fast, they're efficient, and sometimes sometimes we make mistakes with them, but they're really fast. System 2, on the other hand, we can catch the mistakes that system 1 makes, but system 1 is lazy. And it uses a lot of energy. And we don't like using system 2 too much because it would use too much of our cognitive capacity. What I think that the way I think fake news works is it tries to overload system 2. To use a cyber concept, it's a DDoS. It's a distributed denial of service attack. So in a denial of service attack, what a computer will do is it will send queries, information to let's say a server. The server would respond, but since the querying happens so fast and unrelenting, the server can't be used for any other purpose because it's constantly responding to these queries that are coming at it continually. That's called a denial of service because now the server can't serve anyone else. I think that's what happens in fake news. Information is thrown at us to overwhelm our system 2 reasoning so that we rely on our intuitive system 1 reasoning, which tends to be tribal. So we tend to go with the people that we like, as opposed to what maybe is on the merits, the right thing to do. So one of the things that if you want to say that fake news is a form of cyber attack, it would be an attack on the system 2 reasoning of another country's subject psychology. So it would be a kind of hack, but a hack on us as opposed to our computers. I tend to think hacking us as opposed to our computers is, again, something that the entire world, that corporations do, governments do, our family and our friends do to us all the time. They manipulate us all the time. They overload us all the time. And so therefore I would want to save the conflict that is warlike to information security as opposed to information operations, because stealing people's information is not something that governments do all the time. It's actually a very unusual thing for governments to do. Therefore, it seems to me quite distinguishable from the info from the fake news. I'll just point out one thing, which is that what Russia did to the United States, it did a lot of the fake news stuff, but it did the thing that really was problematic was when it hacked the servers of the Democratic National Committee and stole the emails. That was information security violation, not information operations. And it's not even clear to me, frankly, that this fake news stuff makes any difference. There's no evidence that it does. And so I'm not even sure we ought to worry about it. Anyway, that's what I have to say about that.
Scott, is that okay with you to have two more questions for finishing? Yes? So I have a question here from Professor Thiago Hansen. He has not got a microphone, so I'm gonna read the question. And then Marcus says, Thiago, Professor, I would like to ask a question away from today's topic. What has been the experience of producing podcasts with jurisprudence content? How has the reception been for students? And did you happen to learn anything from this experience? And he says he's a big fan of the podcast.
Thank you.
Okay.
First of all, thank you so much. And I'm happy to talk about the podcast. Let me just, so I started a podcast. I mean, it's a joke. Everyone starts a podcast, so I had to do one too. But I started it at the beginning of the lockdown. I'll tell you why I did it. I did it because I just was lonely. I mean, I just, it's like I felt isolated from my colleagues. I felt like I needed to like connect with people, and philosophers and theorists, we connect via theory. So I just thought, hey, why don't I just start a podcast where I teach an entire jurisprudence course, which was an incredibly insane thing to do, because I just had my iPad and I was just talking into the bottom of my iPad, and I hit a button, and then it's really amazing how easy it is to make a fool out of yourself in today's day and age. The thing that I found so interesting from it is that people like to learn stuff. I don't think people were that interested in jurisprudence who listened to it. I just think people like content. People like having people say things to them that make sense. We like to watch television or read the newspaper or play on Twitter and stuff like that. But actually, we also like learning things. We're learning machines. And I was really incredibly surprised by how many people were grateful that that somebody was giving them content. I think part of it also is all of us were, especially at the beginning of the lockdown, I think we were all going kind of nuts. And I think we all were bored. And I think it was something that, people liked to think they were moving forward by learning something. And it was really fun for me because I taught the course a bunch of times. I could do it off the top of my head. It was really, really fun to do. I will say that, my Lord, the ability to get your ideas across in this world is I mean, it's just amazing. I posted yesterday that 10,000 people listened to the first episode. 10,000. I mean, I talk about whether Austin's theory of sovereignty is correct. I mean, it's that boring. But you know, anyway, I hope that was responsive. Yeah.
Okay, just one more, Marcos.
Hello, thank you for the awesome presentation and also for taking one more question. Thank you. I was following the webinar from Facebook and I turned this on just to ask you about accountability for foreign states' attacks. Since you explained it cannot be seen as an act of war because the concept is no more nowadays, and because the attacks are brought from a different jurisdiction, I think there is little one can do to render perpetrators accountable. Maybe a counter-strike with cyber weapons will be the answer? Is there a diplomatic solution or an international cyber forum, something like that? That's the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the excellent question. So I want to say that I have been thinking about this, been writing about it. There's an article in Foreign Policy that Ona and I have that's coming out very soon on this. One of the things that you could do is create so let me back up for a second. One way in which international law has dealt with solving global problems, and one is that they rely on hegemonic actors to do things. Another way that states have dealt with solving global problems is by forming clubs. So the example that Ona and I use in our book is the Montreal Protocol for the Protection of the Ozone Layer. And there, what happened was, in order to stop the ozone from being depleted by chlorofluorocarbons, states formed a club. And what they agreed by forming the club is that they would reduce their use of chlorofluorocarbons according to a certain schedule, but that they would agree to only sell each other the ingredients to make chlorofluorocarbons, as they wouldn't sell these raw materials to people outside the club. This gave and if you made more chlorofluorocarbons than you should have, you get thrown out of the club. Okay, so this was a mechanism for giving people incentives to join the club, and a mechanism for enforcing the club rules through the threat of expulsion. And this was the Montreal Protocol was the most successful environmental agreement ever, and it stopped the hole in the ozone layer, and by 2070 the whole thing should be patched up completely. We suggest that you do the same thing for cyber. That is, what you do is you create these cyber clubs. That is, states who agree to abide by the same kinds of norms have access to each other's networks. Those who don't abide the rules have reduced, and in the case of persistent violation, can be expelled from the network. This would be a particularly useful thing for those in the West to engage in, because frankly, we're shut out of China, and other kinds of cyber adversaries like states in Eastern Europe, their networks are not particularly interesting, are not of particular value to those in the West. And so the thought is that you could create a cyber club and create rules that the members comply with, and you can enforce those rules through the expulsion or limited availability of violators or non-members access to the network. The thing about cyber is that access to the network is everything. That is, you want to be part of the network, and if you shut somebody out, you shut them out of the thing that's valuable about having computers. And so that's one idea for how you would deal with the enforcement problem.
Thank you very much.
Scott, thank you very much for being with us tonight. I think it was great to hear you.
Okay,
Bye
well, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Vera, would you like to say something?
No, just to thank you for your amazing lecture, let's say.
Yeah, can I just say one thing though? Is that
Yeah.
I halfway through it clicked. Of course, I recognize you now.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, you can believe me because I said not before, but now I mean. So anyway,
it's been a long time, more than 20 years, I guess. So.
Yeah, it was 1997, so it was like 23 years ago.
Yeah, 23 years ago. So
you have a good memory.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.